fire that is in us. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hearts and see through them. Take our souls and set them on fire. Amen. Does anybody remember the old television show To Tell the Truth? Yeah. I remember watching it as a kid. It debuted in the 1950s and it was quite popular. In fact, To Tell the Truth remains one of the longest running shows of all time because it spanned 6 decades. Now, if you haven't seen it, it's a game show of sorts. There's a host, a panel of 4 judges, and 3 contestants. Now, one of the contestants had some unusual occupation or it had an unusual experience. And the other 2 contestants were trying to pass themselves off as this person. And so the rules were that the real person had to tell the truth, but the imposters were allowed to lie. And all 3 contestants were trying to get as many votes as possible because that's how they won the money on the show. So, for example, there's this episode from 1972 where the person in question, his job was, he was the wine taster for the Queen of England. And so the show begins with 3 very English-looking gentlemen walking onto stage and introducing themselves to the audience. And of course the MC would say, contestant number 1, and he would say, my name is Jack Rutherford. Contestant number 2, my name is Jack Rutherford. Contestant number 3, my name is Jack Rutherford. And then the celebrity judges took it in turns to ask each of the contestants questions about wine and the production of wines to try and figure out who was the real McCoy and who were the imposters. And at the end of the interviewing, the judges each cast their votes for who they thought the real person was. And at this point, the host would say, would the real Jack Rutherford please stand up? And the 3 guys would look at each other, kind of hesitate, and then one of them would stand up and everybody would clap. So that's to tell the truth. And that seems to me the game that is going on today in our reading from Exodus. Because the question is, who is responsible for leading Israel out of Egypt? And there are actually 3 contestants, 3 contenders. Contestant number 1 is the Lord. Contestant number 2 is Moses. And contestant number 3 is a newly minted calf made of gold. And each of them, in today's reading, each of them is described by somebody as the one who brought Israel up out of the land of Egypt. And so today's episode opens with the Israelites coming to Aaron, the brother of Moses. Moses has been on the mountain for some time now. And so the people gather around Aaron and they say, come, make gods for us who shall go up before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. So Aaron takes gold from the people, forms it into a mold, casts an image of a calf. And when the people see it, they proclaim, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Well, if that wasn't enough, God seems to get into the game. Because the scene shifts up to the mountain. And the Lord looks at Moses and says, go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They've been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. And they have cast for themselves an image of a calf, and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now this is a very interesting scene. I find it kind of humorous because notice how the Lord distances himself from his people, just like a parent might do when discussing the bad behavior of one of their children. I mean, you've seen this, you've probably participated in this. One parent says to another, do you know what your daughter did at school today? And the other was like, not my daughter, your daughter. And so it is with Moses. Moses isn't going to take responsibility for the actions of God's children. As he will say later, I didn't conceive this people. I didn't give birth to this people. And so Moses throws it back to God. Oh Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt? And so in the span of just 14 verses, there are no less than 5 references to one who brought Israel up from the land of Egypt. And as I said, there are 3 different candidates for this job. The Lord, Moses, and the golden calf. And what the audience is dying to know is, would the real God of Israel please stand up? Now this phrase that we have heard repeated isn't new. In fact, we heard it last week in the introduction to the 10 Commandments. God begins as follows. I am Yahweh, the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And notice the logic. Yahweh lays claim to the Israelites. Yahweh is Israel's God because Yahweh rescued Israel. And therefore Israel should have no other gods, no other allegiances above Yahweh. And this same logic flows into the 2nd commandment. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God. In other words, Yahweh is not interested in sharing his people with any of the other so-called gods in the ancient Near East. Yahweh is Israel's God, and Israel is his people. End of story. Now at the time, the people are all good with this. With one voice they say, everything that the Lord has spoken we will do. And they enter into an exclusive covenant with their God Yahweh. So why? Just a few chapters into this new relationship, is Israel so quick to abandon God? So quick to break the covenant that they just entered into? Why do the people clamor for an idol? Why do they kneel down and offer sacrifices to this mute object rather than to the living God? Well, in a word, they're afraid. In 2 words, they're fearful and forgetful. The Israelites are afraid of what's to become of them. And in their fear, they have forgotten all that the Lord has already done for them. They've forgotten the love and concern the Lord has already shown them. Their fear has been triggered by the extended absence of Moses. 8 chapters earlier, Moses ascended Mount Sinai to meet with God. That was nearly 6 weeks ago. Moses has been up on that smoldering mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. And the Israelites are terrified. They don't know what's become of this Moses who led them out of Egypt. Moses who stretched out his arms and made an escape route through the Red Sea. Moses who struck a rock with his staff and caused sweet fresh waters to flow in the wilderness. Moses who provided meat and manna when the people were hungry. Moses who speaks with the Lord they dare not speak to. They don't know what's become of Moses, and so they're afraid of what will become of them. They're without a home, without a land to call their own. They've left the only home that they've ever known. Yes, they were slaves. Yes, the work was hard. Yes, they were sore oppressed. But it was familiar. It was predictable. They knew what to expect. They knew how to respond. They had food, water, and shelter. They had families, and they knew how to take care of them. Back in Egypt, that is. But not in this place. Not in this new place, this place between places. Egypt is far behind them, and Canaan is still further on ahead. And so who will guide them through the wilderness? Who will protect them from the other nations? Who will feed and water them on their journey? Who will show them the way to the promised land? In short, who will go before them? Without Moses, the Israelites feel rudderless, adrift in a wide wilderness ocean. Without Moses, the people of God experience the absence of God. And so, forgetting all that the Lord has done for them, they make gods for themselves so that they might not feel alone, so that they might not fear the future. But how ludicrous they all were. How ludicrous to think that an object of gold could ever compensate for their sense of God's absence. How ludicrous to think that an object that cannot hear or speak could ever serve as a substitute for the living God. How ludicrous to think that an image of their own making could protect and provide for them. How ludicrous to think that an image that they have to carry around could ever go before them and guide them into the future. Listen, if you can make it, it's not God. If you can carry it, it's not God. So how ludicrous they were, and how so very much like us. How often as a society, as a nation, as individuals, as a community of faith, have we made gods for ourselves because we were afraid of what was to become of us? How often do we turn our fears into idols, giving our lives over to things that cannot hear, cannot speak, cannot act, hoping beyond hope that somehow they might comfort and protect and guide us? How often do we flee from our fears by adopting coping mechanisms, methods of numbing and distracting ourselves from the pain and uncertainties in life? Of course, these strategies never actually work because we can't get enough of what we don't need. It's impossible to satisfy our need for the living God with gods of our own making. And we know this. Intuitively, we know this. But we still find ourselves, despite our best efforts, turning to counterfeit gods of one sort or another. So what's the alternative? When life becomes difficult and unmanageable, when we find ourselves becoming anxious and fearful of the future, what's the alternative to following gods of our own making? What can we do that will help us stand firm in the Lord? Help us keep our trust in the living yet invisible God. Well, in his letter to the Philippians, the Apostle Paul offers the following counsel. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say it, rejoice. Don't worry about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. These are powerful words, made even more powerful by the fact that Paul writes them from a prison cell. Rejoicing, making requests, that is sage advice grounded in Paul's extensive experience of walking with God. So how often are we to rejoice in the Lord? Paul says always. And when do we make our requests known to God? In every situation. In other words, rejoicing and making requests are habits that we cultivate. Rejoicing and making requests are practices that we engage in both the good times and in the bad times. In those mornings when we wake up feeling refreshed, and in those mornings when we can't bear to crawl out of bed. We practice these habits always and in every situation so that we can turn to them when we need them most. Now, I'd like to say that if you engage in these spiritual practices, that life will become easy. But I'm not so sure that's true. These practices aren't designed to fix life or distract us from life's struggles. Rather, they're designed to keep us connected to God, to keep us focused on God. Rejoicing in the Lord keeps us aware of the living God who is present, even in the midst of chaos. Making our requests known to God keeps us trusting in the loving God who never abandons us to our pains or our fears. And so, following the advice of Paul, let us rejoice in the Lord always, and in everything, by prayer with thanksgiving, let us make our requests known to God. And the God who brought Israel up from the land of Egypt, that very same God will go before us and give us his peace. The peace that comes to us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.